You won't believe what happened in today's story.
The town woke as if an unseen bell had been rung. It was not a bell but a chorus, 50 dogs, some chained, some loose, some thin and furious, all at once lifting their muzzles to the same dark and howling. The sound came from every yard and alley of Millersford Bay and filled the narrow night between the closed windows like wind through bones. Amos sat up in the chair by his kitchen window and listened. The room smelled of wet pavement even though the sky had been dry all day, a smell that was not rain but something older, the sour tang of embalming fluid and the sweet, slow rot of mountain ash left to ferment. He did not own a dog. He did not much like other people's animals. He had not liked the funeral home on the corner since his father had wheeled him past its frosted glass when he was a child, the smell of alcohol thick, the lights too steady. The funeral home had been a museum for 20 years. They put the word funeral in plain block letters now and left a glass case of mourning jewelry by the front door for tourists to stare at. Amos had been dreaming but jolted awake by the howling. The dream remembered itself, a boy running barefoot on cold tar, a row of houses blurred, a smell of damp smoke, the impression of being watched from inside an attic. There had been a small pair of footprints, impossibly small, no longer than his palm, pressed into the soft mud by the curb. They vanished at the gutter. He could still feel the shock of seeing them, a wrongness like a page torn out of a book. He told himself it had been a fragment from the past. His dreams came that way now, little shards that belonged to other people. He finished his coffee, thick and black, and went outside to the porch. The night was near and pulpy. The dog's howls thinned into an uneasy chorus of whimpers, and then silence. On the sidewalk by the curb there were prints. Not his shoes were dry and lined with the dust of his garage, but the tiny pale indentations pressed into the damp leaf litter. 2 prints, toes pointed inward, as if someone very small had been walking awkwardly, trying to find their balance. The soil was not wet from rain. The prints were damp in a way that suggested they had been made by someone who had been standing in steam, or something warmer than the air. Amos crouched. The prints were a child's. Even in the streetlight they seemed wrong for the town. The world had no small children in that block anymore, not since the decade of empty porches and mortgage signs. He traced with the tip of a gloved finger the outline of the bigger print beside the small. The bigger was adult, a boot, not his but the heavy heel used by road workers or men who carried things. Between them, in the softened asphalt, was a smudged smear like a thumbprint dragged through mud. The house across the street had its curtains drawn. The museum's neon was off. A faded poster of a funeral director's gown hung crooked in the display window. Amos listened for footsteps behind him, and the whole block held its breath. He had lived on this block his entire life. His grandparents had moved into a modest duplex when the mill still turned. In the ledger of births and burials, a book that his mother kept like an offering on the hall table, there were names that repeated with the neatness of a cough. People married, people moved away, people died. 10 houses on the cul-de-sac. 10 families who 50 years ago had done something they were ashamed of and then named it differently in polite company. Amos had always suspected as much. Suspicion had the texture of old paper in his hands. When he walked, he was not thinking about packs or ledgers. He was thinking about the footprints and a dream that felt like someone else's memory. His key scraped in the lock of the house next to his, one his family had rented out for years. The tenant was gone, left a pile of mail months back and an empty refrigerator that someone had taken the trouble to move out. He pushed the door open and the house exhaled. Stale wood, a faint chemical sweetness, like the memory of a room that had been cleaned for a wake. On the kitchen table, under a dinner plate coated with dust, there sat a ledger. It was not large, bound in cracked leather, ribbon fraying. The cover had no title. Something about it made Amos's chest tighten. His fingers hovered above it, and for a nonsense reason he remembered the boy in the dream looking back at him with eyes like dark coins. He flipped the cover. Ink had faded into brown slashes. Names marched down the page in a practiced hand. Mercer, Lyle, Hart, names he knew. Beside some there were numbers, beside others a single word, settled. The page was dense with dates from the 1950s. Amos turned the next sheet and a folded packet slipped free. It was a small envelope sealed with yellowed adhesive. When he peeled it open, a thin strip of paper fell into his palm, a debt note, a promise signed by 10 names. The signatures were spidery and decisive. One was his grandfather's. Something in him, a memory not his own, trembled at the sight. He read the sum, a figure that meant more then than it did now, a figure paid in labor, in silence, in favors. At the bottom, in a different hand, someone had scrawled a phrase, "By moon we return." The ink had bled slightly as though written in haste. The museum bell tinkled then, though no one was there. From the direction of the funeral home came the metallic scrape of a display case closing, followed by the faint thumping of cardboard being moved, and then nothing at all. The hairs along Amos's forearms raised as if someone had walked a hand down his spine. His mouth was dry. He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket. On the walk home, the town still smelled of wet pavement and embalming fluid. Above the sloped roofs, the sky held no moon. A pale haze puffed like breath where clouds should have been. He kept seeing the tiny footprints at the curb, the way they pointed inward as if to the center of something. That night Amos dreamed again. He was a boy running through an attic corridor, the wood damp beneath his feet. He rounded a corner and a man in a funeral director's vest looked down at him. The man's face was hidden, but his voice was the voice Amos had known all his life, soft, absolute. "We agreed," the voice said, "always at the call of the bay." The boy Amos looked down. His hands were muddy. Between his toes, someone had smeared the ledger's curved script across his skin. He woke with a taste of ink on his tongue. In the morning, he took the ledger to the museum. He told the woman at the front desk, whose name tag read Elaine, that he had found it in the vacant house. Her face, at first, did not change. Then, when she read the names, she paled until the hospital light in the display window made her jaw look chalky. "You shouldn't have that," she said quietly. "Why?" Amos asked. Elaine folded the page like a ritual and pointed to the display case behind her where, among the funeral cards and mourning beads, a small pair of child's shoes sat on black satin, brown leather, cracked, no larger than his palm. The shoes were not new to her gaze. They had been there for as long as the museum had been open. They were also not there the night before. Amos thought he would have remembered. "Those come out when the town remembers," Elaine said. Her eyes had the shimmer of someone who had been thinking of this for a long time. "When the bay sings." Outside, a dog howled once, and at that small, tuned note, dozens more picked it up like a second voice. The sound moved over the roof lines, over the blocked chimneys, and inside Amos, the ledger was a weight against his ribs. He could not say if it was guilt he felt or something more patient, an old calculus balancing itself into view. He asked simply, and the question felt foolish, what was the pact? Elaine looked at him as if measuring how much of the past he could carry. She opened her mouth and then closed it. The thin smile she gave was not kindly. "It was called a settling," she said, "and it is not finished." Part 2, Graham Mercer. The first time Graham heard the dogs, he thought he was dreaming. He lived alone in the old duplex, his wife gone 5 years now, the rooms full of the soft hiss of his oxygen machine. But the howling punched through the hum, carried like a tide into the walls. He pulled himself upright, chest heaving, and listened. The dogs were everywhere, and beneath their noise was something else, a rhythm, a pulse. He thought of church organs, of his mother's hymn book, but the sound was not holy. He slept in a recliner in the living room because the stairs to the bedroom were too much. From where he sat, he could see the front door, the chain dangling useless. He had never locked it, not in Millersford Bay, not on that block. Tonight the chain was swinging as if someone had touched it. Graham wheeled his oxygen tank closer and shuffled to the door. When he opened it, the night air hit him sharp, cold, carrying a sweet char like wet smoke. The street was empty, leaves pressed flat to the pavement. He lowered his eyes and saw them, the same impossible footprints Amos Lyle had found hours earlier, small, bare, pressed deep though the ground was dry. He muttered not again, though he could not have said why. Inside, he tried to steady himself, but the smell of damp smoke only thickened. He sat back, adjusted the plastic tube under his nose, and closed his eyes. Sleep came in fragments. In the dream, he was 12 again, standing at the edge of the block where all 10 houses faced each other like mirrors. The men of their families, his father, Amos's grandfather, the Harts, the Coopers, stood in a circle under the lamp. Their shadows bent across the wet tar. Something small moved in the middle of the circle, something breathing quick. Graham saw a boy, younger than he had been, crouched low, hair plastered, eyes shining. And the men spoke all at once, their voices overlapping into one cold sentence. "Settled, by moon we return." Graham woke with the oxygen mask pressed against his face and the echo of those words still in his ears. The machine hissed steady, but the house itself was no longer quiet. He could hear movement upstairs, a creak of a board, the slow drag of something soft, a heel, a hand, his chest seized with memory. That sound had haunted the block in his boyhood, before the funeral home turned museum, before the town tried to forget. He did not want to go up there. His legs were weak, lungs weaker, but the noise was deliberate, a step, a pause, then another, the sound of someone waiting for him to climb. He pressed his palms together until the bones ached. "God help me," he whispered. Then the front window rattled. He turned and saw, through the glass, Amos crossing the street. The man's jacket bulked odd at the chest, as if carrying something. Graham staggered to the door and opened it. "You've got it, don't you?" Graham said without preamble. Amos blinked. "You dreamed it too." "The ledger," Graham's voice rasped, brittle. "You shouldn't have touched it. None of us should have." Upstairs the noise stopped. Silence pressed down hard. Graham and Amos both looked up. The ceiling bulged with shadow, a deeper black than the corners of the room. And then with no sound at all, a child's laugh threaded through the silence. Thin, delighted, wrong. Graham felt his knees give, the oxygen mask slipped. He clutched Amos's arm, whispering with a mouth gone dry. It started again. Outside, a single dog howled, then another, then all 50. Part 3, Daniel Hart. Daniel Hart never woke easy, not since the mill closed and the night shift vanished from his life, but the dogs made sure of it. Their howling poured through the thin walls of his rented flat like a floodlight through a cracked curtain. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, counting the voices. 50, maybe more, the sound braided tight, pulling the town taut. He rose slow, pulled on his boots. The air had that wrong smell again, rainless pavement, sharp and mineral, undercut by a faint sweetness like sap scorched in fire. He stepped outside. The streetlights fizzed, one after another, as if someone had run a hand along their spines. On the corner he saw Amos, shoulders hunched, talking low with old Graham Mercer, who clutched his oxygen mask like it might float him out of drowning. Their faces looked peeled back, thinned by fear. Daniel thought of turning away. He didn't much speak with Amos or Graham. He didn't much speak with anyone since his brother disappeared 50 years back. The family called it running away. The block never asked too loud. But the dogs had dragged that old scar out of him, and the smell of damp smoke seemed to come from his own chest. He walked over. Don't, Graham wheezed, lifting a trembling hand. It's not your night. Amos shook his head, eyes sharp. We all dreamed it. It is his night. Daniel frowned, dreamed what? Neither answered. Instead, Amos drew out a leather-bound ledger from inside his jacket. The sight of it bent Daniel's knees. He had seen that book once in his father's hands on the night of his brother's disappearance. His father had snapped it shut when Daniel asked. Some debts aren't yours, he'd said, voice low as dirt. The ledger looked smaller now, but heavier somehow. Amos opened it, turning pages so brittle they rasped like dry leaves. Daniel leaned closer, unwilling, and there it was, his family name. Hart, inked neat, dated 1954. Beside it, a mark, a cross, as if canceling something out. Daniel's throat closed. He remembered his brother's bare feet in the yard, how they slapped on the porch steps, quick as a deer. He remembered the way his father had held the boy by the shoulders that last evening, whispering something urgent, almost pleading. He remembered the night ending without him. His brother gone, the adult silent, his questions hushed with heavy hands. The ledger gave him back the feeling, loss sealed as transaction. From the museum, the old funeral home, its windows dark but alive, a glow began. Not electric, not candle. A green shimmer that swelled like breath against the glass. Daniel turned to Amos. What is that? But Amos didn't answer. He was staring past Daniel at the ground. Daniel followed his gaze. Footprints again, smaller than a child's, wet though the pavement was bone dry. They led from Daniel's porch across the road toward the museum, stopping at the curb as if the walker had paused to wait. And with that sight, memory tore open fully. Daniel's brother had not run. He had walked barefoot, guided by the men in the circle, guided toward the funeral home. Graham pulled the mask tight, whispering, settled, by moon we return. His eyes brimmed, wet and terrified. Daniel felt a shift inside him, a cold understanding, like a blade laid flat against the heart. The dogs broke into fresh howls. From the museum came the sound of something knocking from the inside of a display case, polite and steady, like a child asking to be let out. Part 4, Thomas Cooper. Thomas Cooper had always worked with his hands. Carpentry mostly, porches, rafters, the kind of work that left splinters in the palms and the smell of sawdust ground into clothes. His shop sat 3 doors down from the museum, and he'd been closing up late when the dogs began their chorus. The sound didn't just wake him. It rattled the nails in the beams, made the glass jars on his workbench hum. 50 voices, all pointed at once toward the bay. Thomas stepped into the street, wiping his palms on his apron. He saw Amos and Graham together under the lamppost, their faces drained, Daniel Hart just behind them, staring at the ground like it had pulled a memory out of him. And beyond them, the museum glowed faint green. He didn't want any part of it. He had built his life on staying out of his family's history. The Coopers had always been part of the pact, he knew that, though no one said it outright. His father had died young, his mother sour and tight-lipped, his uncle gone without a trace. Thomas had survived by refusing to ask questions. But then he saw it. On the step of his workshop lay a pair of prints, bare feet, too small to be a man's, too wide to be a child's toy. Wet dark, pressed into the dry wood as though something had stepped straight out of water. He froze, the prints led inside. He flicked on the shop light, shadows swung up the walls. Every tool was in its place, neat as always, except for the hammer on his bench. Its handle was wet, slick as if dipped in something more than water. He picked it up, his palm came away dark, not blood, not paint, ink thick black, still tacky. And then, as if the air itself was rifling through his skull, he remembered a night he hadn't let himself remember. He was only a boy hiding under his father's work table. The men had gathered in the shop after dark, 10 of them, shoulders hunched, faces carved sharp by lamplight. They had the ledger open on the bench, and one by one they pressed their thumbs into ink, stamping names onto a folded slip. Thomas had thought it a game until he heard the crying. Soft, stifled, behind the wall where lumber was stacked, a child's voice, and his father saying, "It's only fair, one for all, one settles the rest." He had covered his ears, he had never asked, and after that night his uncle was gone. The shop light buzzed louder, hotter. The ink on the hammer smeared down his arm like it was alive. From the street, Amos called his name. Thomas stepped outside, trembling, hammer still in his grip. "You've seen them," Amos said. Thomas nodded, and I remember. His voice cracked like splintered wood. Behind them, the museum windows throbbed with that pale green light. Inside, something was moving, not shadow, not reflection, but shapes. Small, barefoot shapes pacing the glass. Graham wheezed, "It's calling us all." Daniel muttered, "It's not finished." And Thomas, staring at the museum where the howling seemed to collect, felt the hammer grow heavy in his hand, as though waiting to be used. The dogs howled once more, then cut off in the same instant, leaving the block hollow with silence. And in that silence from the museum came 3 slow knocks. Part 5. Leonard Briggs. Leonard Briggs had never believed in dreams. He called them the mind's tricks, the nervous system running its circuits while the body slept. He had worked nights as a train dispatcher for decades, a man used to following schedules and signals, trusting only the steel tracks beneath his hands and the timetables he memorized, but the howling reached him anyway. It started with the windows. Leonard's small apartment overlooked the narrow alley behind the block. He sat up, rubbing his face, and listened. 50 dogs baying, rising and falling like a tide. Then, beneath the baying, a second sound, a wet scraping, light and deliberate, moving from the alley toward the street. He stepped onto the balcony. His apartment had always smelled faintly of coal dust and old oil. Tonight it was sharp, like ash from wet smoke, sour and sticky in the throat. On the ground below, footprints appeared, as if etched by someone unseen. Tiny, pale, pressed into the dust and dirt of the alley, they led toward the curb. Next to them were larger booted prints, men's boots, heavy and steady. Leonard recognized the shape immediately. It was the same style his father had worn when he had delivered parcels around the block in the 1950s. He shivered. Something about the prints tugged memory from his own childhood. A half-remembered scrape of a ledger, a folded envelope, whispers through the halls of his family home, long before the block became quiet, long before his brother had vanished. Leonard climbed down, careful, counting steps. He followed the prints toward the museum. The green glow pulsed behind the frosted glass, soft and wrong. He could see shapes inside. Children's shoes on black satin, the gleam of inked ledger pages, shadows that bent in impossible ways. Amos, Graham, Daniel, and Thomas were gathered at the corner, eyes fixed on the museum. Each held something. Amos the ledger, Graham the oxygen mask like a shield, Daniel with a hand on Amos's shoulder, Thomas still gripping the ink-stained hammer. Leonard felt his pulse speed. He had avoided his family's history for years, but tonight it called him by name. Inside his mind, the memory surfaced. 10 men, gathered in silence, signing their promises, stamping their debts with ink. A boy crying quietly in the corner, unseen by most. A brother disappearing into the night. Leonard's father had said nothing, only nodded, then left him to wait until morning. He stepped closer. The footprints ended at the curb. But now new ones appeared, his own, small, bare, pressing into the concrete even though he had shoes on. He looked down, confusion twisting him. He had not moved his feet. From the museum a scraping sound rose, metal against glass. Then a whisper carried faintly through the night air, "By moon we return." The dogs broke their silence once again, 50 voices calling out, and Leonard felt the ledger's weight in Amos's hands pull at his memory like a tether. He swallowed, trembling. "It's not just us," he said. "It's all of us, every name." Amos nodded. "Every family, every block, every year it comes back. The settling is never finished." The 4 men stood together on the wet pavement, the footprints leading them like a chain toward the museum, toward the secrets that had waited decades for them to remember. And above, the sky remained empty, rainless, indifferent. Part 6. Victor Hale. Victor Hale had lived in Millersford Bay his whole life, though he rarely left the second floor of the small apartment he'd inherited from his aunt. He painted furniture, repaired clocks, and measured the hours with exacting care. But tonight, the rhythm of the dogs tore through his routines like wind through broken shutters. He rose from his workbench, hands smeared with varnish, and moved to the window, 50 dogs howling. The sound carried across the rooftops, rattling chimneys, making the bay itself tremble. It was not random. Victor felt it in his chest, a summons. On the street below, he saw Amos, Graham, Daniel, Thomas, and Leonard. They were drawn toward the museum, their faces pale and tight with unease. Something glimmered in their hands, a ledger, an ink-stained hammer, the weight of decades pressing down. Victor hesitated. He had tried to forget, tried to leave the block and its secrets behind. But the air smelled wrong, wet ash, smoke, and the faint sweetness of old embalming fluid, and the street seemed to hum with memory. He stepped outside. The leaves were damp underfoot, though the sky was dry. Bare footprints led from his aunt's house to the museum. They were small, too small to belong to any living child. Beside them, larger prints, men's boots, precise, heavy, unyielding. Victor's heart clenched. He knew them. They matched the shape his father's boots had made the night of the pact decades ago. He followed the prints, memories pressed against him. The 10 families gathered in shadowed rooms, signing, stamping, exchanging promises. A brother lost, a ledger folded, hidden. A phrase whispered over the boy, "By moon we return." Victor's fingers tingled. He could feel the ink's weight even now, as though the ledger had chosen him to carry its memory. At the corner, he joined the others. Amos opened the ledger. The green glow from the museum thickened, spilling through the windows, making the inside shimmer like water under moonlight. From the display case, a soft metallic scrape, deliberate and slow. The small shoes on the black satin glimmered. Victor's breath caught. He had not dreamed, he remembered. The pact, the settling. Every year, every generation, they were called back. The dogs' howls rose, 50 voices weaving into a single, relentless note. Victor felt the tether tighten around him, a pull through the street, past the lampposts, toward the museum's doors. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The past was here, alive, waiting. Amos whispered, "All 10, every one of us, we're only beginning." Victor nodded, the weight of recognition settling into his bones. The museum waited, patient, for the last pieces to come home. The night stretched rainless, silent between the howls, and the green light pulsed like a heart beneath the frosted glass. Part 7. Edward Larkin. Edward Larkin had never been superstitious. He measured the world by clocks, contracts, and the precise alignment of his father's law books. But the howling yanked at his convictions. 50 dogs, coordinated, wild, and ritualistic, calling something older than memory across Millersford Bay. He dressed quickly, lacing boots over pale socks, hands trembling. The smell hit him the moment he opened the door, wet ash, damp pavement, and the faint chemical tang of embalming fluid from the museum across the street. He knew it by instinct, not from having been there often, but from decades of proximity, the lingering memory of the old funeral home where his father had apprenticed. Outside, the others were already gathering. Amos Lyle held the ledger with reverence. Graham wheezed beside him. Daniel Hart traced the small footprints as if they could tell him the past. Thomas Cooper clutched his ink-stained hammer. Leonard Briggs's eyes darted to every shadow, and Victor Hale followed, silent and rigid. Edward's gaze fell to the street. There they were, the footprints, tiny, impossible, pressed into the leaf-damp asphalt. Beside them, heavier boot prints, a deliberate accompaniment. He felt a tremor of recognition. His father had walked this path once decades ago, and Edward had watched from the window as a boy, sensing only the tension in the adult's shoulders. His mother had called it business, his father had called it settling, but Edward had understood the meaning in silence. As he approached, the museum pulsed with green light. A low scraping echoed from inside, metal against glass. Something moved behind the frosted windows, shapes bending, small and precise. Edward's hands clenched, the ledger called to him, though Amos held it now. He remembered fragments from childhood. The night of the pact, 10 men gathered in a circle, signatures inked and pressed. A child hidden in the corner, watching. A brother lost, vanished into the night. The words whispered in his father's voice, "By moon we return." The dogs howled again, 50 voices braided into one unbroken note. Edward's stomach clenched. He had tried to rationalize it all, reduce it to schedules and shadows, but the proof was here. The footprints, the green glow, the sound that pressed against his chest. Amos turned toward him. "Edward, you remember, don't you?" Edward nodded, swallowing hard. Memory flooded him in fragments, the ledger, the small shoes in the museum case, the way his father had signed away a secret he could never speak aloud. From the museum, a thump, then another. The display case shook, the shoes trembled, the green light pulsed faster, brighter. The entire block seemed to hold its breath. Amos whispered, "We're all here now, 9 of us, only one remains." Edward's pulse spiked, the weight of decades pressed down upon him. 50 dogs, 50 voices, all calling, demanding, remembering. The night was rainless, still, and patient. Part 8. Philip Nash. Philip Nash had always believed in leaving the past buried. A quiet man, accountant by trade, he kept his ledgers balanced, his family history tucked neatly into old boxes in the attic. But tonight, Millersford Bay refused quiet. 50 dogs screamed across the streets, their howls sharp, urgent, carrying something older than Philip's own memory. He rubbed his temples and stepped outside. The night air was thick with the familiar wrongness, wet ash, dry yet damp, the lingering tang of embalming fluid. He paused on the curb, staring at the footprints. Bare, impossibly small, leading toward the museum, paired with the heavier boot impressions that marched beside them. Philip's chest tightened. The prints were a map he had long hoped never to follow. They pulled him along the block, past the houses of families he had once known as children. Amos Lyle, S. Graham Mercer, S. Daniel Hart, S. Each step forward drew him deeper into the memory he had long suppressed. Inside the museum, the green glow pulsed stronger. The small shoes in the display case glimmered faintly, and the faint scrape of metal against glass echoed through the silent street. Philip stopped for a moment, recalling fragments of the night of the pact. 10 men gathered in shadows, signatures inked with precision, a ledger folded and passed, a child left to watch, a brother taken and vanished without explanation. The words still whispered across the years, "By moon we return." He stepped closer to the group, Amos holding the ledger, Graham gripping his oxygen mask, Daniel staring at the footprints, Thomas with the ink-stained hammer, Leonard, Victor, and Edward lined up beside them. 9 of them, only one remained. Philip felt the pull of the block of memory, of history pressing in. Each footstep carried decades of unspoken promises and sins. The dogs' howling intensified, and he realized it was no longer just noise, it was rhythm, directive, a summons he could not resist. As he approached the museum steps, the green light seemed to reach out, a living pulse urging them forward. From within came the faintest sound of a child laughing, delighted, wrong, echoing against the glass and into their bones. Amos whispered, "We are almost complete. 10 names, 10 men. The ledger is almost whole." Philip swallowed, feeling the weight of memory and obligation settle into him. The pact was not finished. The settling had only just begun. The night held its breath, rainless, waiting, patient. The dogs' howls rose once more, 50 voices merging into a single, unstoppable call. Part 9. Walter Crane. Walter Crane had always been the quietest of them all, the one who lingered at the edges unnoticed. A librarian by profession, he catalogued the lives of others while carefully shelving his own. But tonight, the town of Millersford Bay refused his usual discretion. 50 dogs bayed in unison, their cries carving through the stillness of the block, forcing history to the surface. He opened his front door and froze. The air was thick with the strange, wet smell, dry yet damp ash smoke and the faint metallic tang of embalming fluid. The footprints lay before him, bare and impossibly small, alongside heavier booted prints, marching in deliberate parallel toward the museum. Walter's stomach clenched. The path was familiar, more than familiar. It traced memories he had tried to archive, lock away behind pages and spines. The night of the pact came back in fragments. 10 men gathered in dim light, signatures pressed into folded slips, a child crouched silently in the corner, a brother taken, vanished. "By moon we return," whispered the years through the floorboards, through the dust on the shelves. He followed the footprints, each step heavier than the last. Amos held the ledger, Graham clutched his oxygen mask, Daniel, Thomas, Leonard, Victor, Edward, and Philip all moved as if tethered to a single force. 9 of them, only one remained. The museum pulsed with green light. From within, the display case shifted slightly, the small shoes trembling, a faint metallic scrape like metal moving against glass. The air hummed with anticipation. Walter felt the past pressing against him, a tide of unspoken promises and sins, decades of secrecy and silence. The dogs' howls rose, 50 voices weaving into one relentless note, urging him forward. Amos spoke low, reverent, "We are all here now, 9 of us. Only one remains to complete the circle." Walter swallowed, memory and obligation weighed on him like chains. The pact was alive, the settling was not finished. The night, rainless and patient, waited. The green light throbbed from the museum, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the dogs' unified call surged again, filling every alley, every yard, every empty porch with its ancient, inexorable rhythm.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to see more stories.